This video is sponsored by Ironweld, a miniature gaming convention and 40k tournament held on May 27th and 28th. And if you like 40k tournaments, go ahead and check us out over on the Discord. If you're watching this video on release, you have less than 24 hours to register for our end of edition GT. We're running an unlocked list grand tournament over on the Discord for T5S2 points and sweet prizes, so please go check us out over there. I'll drop some links down in the video description. And let's get into the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and I am just recovering from a cold. So if I sound a little hoarse, that would be why. This is another 40k tournament tech talk video, where we take a look at some of the undefeated lists from the previous week that were super cool and talk about what makes them tick. While normally we choose one list or maybe one faction to look at, there were so many cool lists over this last weekend. It was probably one of the most diverse weekends that we've seen in Warhammer 40k in a really long time. So I picked 4. I couldn't decide, so I did all of them. As always, we're going to do a breakdown of the lists themselves, the event that they won, and a little bit of a quick recap of the opponents that they played against. But because we are talking about 4 separate lists, we're not going to spend too much diving into the extraneous details and mostly talking about the lists and players themselves. As always, if you enjoy my style of Warhammer 40k content and these 40k Tech Talk videos, let me know down in the comment section. Maybe drop a like on the video, you know, one of those little thumbs ups. Love those. And a subscribe on the channel if you're not already. I really appreciate it. And let's talk about our video sponsor today, Ironweld. Let me get my crystal ball and call me a psychic, because I'm about to make a bold prediction here. Which is that if you're watching this video about Warhammer tournaments, you probably enjoy miniature gaming tournaments yourself. And if you're looking for one to go to in the next couple months, oh boy, have I got news for you. Because this video is sponsored by Ironweld, a new event run by the folks over at Wicked Dicey. Ironweld is going to be a cross-denominational miniature gaming extravaganza run on the weekend of May 27th and 28th. It'll have events and seminars for games of all types, including Star Wars Legion, MCP, Conquest, Battletech, Malifaux, and many more. But of course, the headliners are GT level events for both Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar. The Wicked Dicey crew put on Everwinter this past December, an event for which I streamed most of the 40k GT, so I can say with experience that the crew puts on some incredible shows, and Ironweld promises to be even bigger and better. This convention is even being held near my neck of the woods in Wakefield, Massachusetts. There's awesome access, good parking for folks who are driving in, and a lot of awesome local activities. So clear out the weekend of May 27th and 28th and check out wickeddicey.com/Ironweld to get your ticket today. We're going to start things off a little bit slow today and talk about a classic, but the classic of a faction that has not been doing so well in the Arcs of Omen season since its precipitous loss in power level from the Warzone Nephilim season, and that being Blood Angels. Blood Angels has been a little bit on the ropes for the last couple of months, and it's cool to see Jeffrey Keister over here go 5-0 with them. This was from the Sunken City Massacre 34-player GT over in West Branch, Michigan. It did use the new data slate, so we were playing the current version of the game, although not all the events that we're going to be talking about today did. Although, to be fair, for Blood Angels, I don't think that changes too much. This list did bring a pretty unique take on Blood Angels, with a brace of special characters, including Commander Dante, Astorath, and the Sanguinor himself. The Sanguinor is a bit of an interesting include. He basically gives you an additional kind of mid-weight Smash character profile with something akin to a Sanguinary Guard stat line. He's base 5 attacks at strength 6, AP 4, 2 damage, but then obviously gets all of the buffs from being a Blood Angel. And I think the most interesting mechanic that he brings to the table is his ability to heroically intervene essentially from Deep Strike. If he is placed in Death from Above and a Blood Angel's unit is charged by an enemy, you can actually have Sanguinor heroically intervene from reserve into engagement range of that enemy, which is pretty wild. That makes it super difficult to engage into an army that's already difficult to engage into. Blood Angels, with the number of heroic interventions they have, and especially even with Sanguinor's ability to heroically intervene 6 inches normally, but also compounding that with mechanics like Unbridled Ardor, and then the ability for their characters to soak attacks of the rest of their units, Blood Angels are extremely difficult to get profitable engages with, and if you're just representing the threat of this Sanguinor jumping in on any unit that you want to save and potentially soaking a bunch of attacks from that unit. That just makes it so difficult to calculate an appropriate direction to attack. The inclusion of Astrath is also an interesting one. He is a chaplain, but he doesn't have a lot of the chaplain mechanics, most notably Wise Orator to give him that 2+ recited litanies. Astrath can, at a base, recite 2 litanies, and in addition has his own unique litany he can recite, Mass of Doom. This grants a random buff to a Blood Angel's core or character, either killing a unit and granting +1 to hit, granting +1 to hit with no drawback, or on a 6, granting a 4+ invulnerable save and +1 to hit in melee. Obviously, that last one is the best, but it comes with the trade-off of potentially killing someone, which isn't that great, to be honest. I think mostly Astrath is in there for his exceptional combat ability. He comes in with a base 4 attacks, much better than a normal chaplain, alongside the Executioner's Axe, which brings him to Strength 6, AP 3 for a flat 3 damage. In addition to that, the list also brought 2 units of Death Company, one with jetpacks, Inferno Pistol, and Plasma Pistols, as well as a bunch of Thunderhammers. These guys are usually used for Forlorn Fury to run up the table ahead of the rest of the army and force your opponent to screen out very heavily any pre-game moves that you could do to them. If you were able to get this Death Company into the heart of your opponent's army on the top of the first turn, you can often do crippling damage to them. A second ground-pounding Death Company is a little bit more idiosyncratic to me, although the ability to pre-game move it and use it as a bit of a screen is actually really interesting. Not entirely sure why you wouldn't shell out for a Primaris Phobos unit to do that, but this gives you a little bit more flexibility, and Death Company Marines do slap pretty hard, so as a chaff clearer, they're pretty solid. We also have a Sanguinary Ancient with the ever-present Soul Warden to give all of these Sanguinary Guard a 5+ damage ignore against mortal wounds. The Wrath of Brawl Relic for the movement increase to jump infantry. 3 units of Sanguinary Guard, including 2 of 6 and 1 of 7. A couple of Inferno Pistols splattered in there as well, alongside a 10 model Vanguard Veteran Squad with a mix of Inferno Pistols and Twin Lightning Claws. This will just combat squad into 2 distinct units, one filled with pistols and one filled with melee weapons, and one to use as a chaff infantry blender, the other one to hit more heavily armored targets with those big Melta pistols. Overall, this is a bit of a classic Blood Angels build with a little bit of flares thrown in there from the Sanguinor and Astrath, those cool special characters, but it's nice to see Blood Angels back where they were around the top of the metagame as one of the game's premier melee armies, especially when it comes to jump infantry Space Marines. In the Second City Massacre, Jeffrey was able to take down Tau Empire, Death Guard, Adepta Sororitas, Salamanders, and Iron Hands, running the gamut of powerful Space Marine chapters, and I'm sure was pretty happy with the fact that not only is the army relatively resilient against Desolation Squads, which Iron Hands are very heavily reliant on right now, but also the lack of Codex Warfare in the post-data slate version of the game means that Iron Hands matchup is a lot easier. The Death Guard matchup in round 2 is a little interesting to me because historically that has been a little bit of a nightmare for Blood Angels. The ability for Death Guard to shut off charges, force fight lasts, and cause their massive 2 damage weapons to be effectively half damage against the Death Guard's disgusting resilience means that a lot of the Blood Angels' offensive power is robbed of them, but a good player can outmaneuver the Death Guard army, especially given the fact that Death Guard are very slow and Blood Angels are one of the most maneuverable armies in the game. Big congratulations to Jeffrey for going 5-0 with Blood Angels, and we'll move on to the next list. Next up, we'll move to the Frontier Open at the Cheyenne Gaming Convention. This was a 40-player GT that unfortunately did not use the data slate. The cutoff was 3 days before the release of the data slate. But it was still won by Colin K playing Black Legion Heretic Astartes, especially since getting an effective nerf with the loss of Armor of Contempt with nothing really to buff them, and not getting the same points treatment that Space Marines did, meaning they pay a lot more for a lot of their units than Space Marines do for basically the same profiles. That said, Chaos Space Marines have a lot more chicanery up their sleeve, and they're definitely been putting it to good work these last couple weeks, with especially Emperor's Children and Black Legion builds doing pretty well. So I was excited to be able to talk about one of these today. This was Colin K's list from the event that went 5-0. And this is a pretty common style of Black Legion that we're seeing pop up more and more. It's led by Abaddon the Despoiler, the Great Man himself, alongside a Dark Apostle, a Master of Possession, and a Sorcerer in Terminator armor, rocking using a bunch of offensive spells, the Mark of Tzeentch and the Veilbreaker Plate. That's followed up by a couple troops options to add some objective holding, 2 units of cultists and a unit of legionnaires, 10 Rubric Marines with Warp Flamers, a Chaos Contemptor Dreadnought with 2 sets of multi-meltas and a Cyclone Missile Launcher alongside the Mark of Tzeentch to allow it to ignore that first failed saving throw, a couple units of Raptors and Chaos Spawn for additional utility, and a big brick of Chaos Bikers. The Chaos Bikers are really the stars of the show. These guys are the new recipients of all of the classic Chaos Space Marine defensive buffs, where Illusory Supplication can go on them to make them trans hitman, remove any hit rerolls against them, as well as the Black Rune of Damnation to make them -1 to be wounded. Alongside Mark of Tzeentch, zeroing out the first failed saving throw every turn going against them, and all of those defensive effects, a high base toughness, plus that -1 to wound, meaning most of the game wounds them on 5s, a lot of the game wounds them on 4s, basically nothing wounds them on anything better than that, and all of the defensive effects that can be put on top of them by the other Chaos characters. These things are incredibly difficult to deal with, and can get some pretty important support effects from things like Confluence of Traders to give them the ability to advance and charge, for example, giving them immense amounts of threat across the table to steal opponents' objectives. The combination of the offensively oriented Chaos Sorcerer alongside the Veilbreaker Plate and a smattering of really powerful core keyworded Chaos Space Marine units in the army is also very effective. There is a 10 model Rubric squad with Warp Flamers, which are actually in some situations slightly better than their Thousand Suns equivalent, thanks to getting the Let the Galaxy Burn faction ability that Chaos Space Marines benefit from, which increases the shots generated by their random shot weapons by 2, meaning that all of those Warp Flamers are close to Tzeentch Flamers from the Chaos Demons faction, at least pre-nerf, where they are all firing D6 plus 2 shots. That gives the list an incredibly powerful hammer unit, but if you need to clear heavily armored enemies, you can also choose the Chaos Contemptor Dreadnought as the target of that Veilbreaker instead. That thing can jump in, fire its multi-meltas and Cyclone Missile Launchers at Melta range, and potentially be a little bit difficult to kill thanks to that Mark of Tzeentch on the swing back. All of that is benefited, obviously, from Abaddon's rerolls, and just the fact that Abaddon himself is an absolute truck, and behind the screen of all of those Chaos Bikers we just talked about, with the cheap units like Raptors, Cultists, and Chaos Spawn holding the backline and completing secondary objectives, it makes the list pretty difficult to deal with. Overall, it's an extremely technical list, and I think one of the coolest ones to come out of the Chaos Space Marine Codex. It's a little bit less straightforward than just rocking Noise Marines at somebody or the OG Terminator bricks of old. Obviously, those Terminator lists are way worse right now, but it's cool to see that Chaos Space Marines has been able to evolve in such a way that they're still putting up some pretty solid results. And this is not the first 5-0 that a list like this has been able to achieve. This weekend in particular, the list was able to take down Imperial Fists on Tear Down Their Icons, a little bit of a softball for the first round, unfortunately, for those Imperial Fists. Space Wolves on Abandoned Sanctuaries, Word Bearers on The Scouring, Iron Hands on Death and Zeal, and as we have to remember, this is pre-nerf Iron Hands, so they are still benefiting from the OG version of Codex Warfare, getting 2 points anytime they kill anything ever, essentially, as well as Ulthwé Eldari in the finals on Conversion. That brought Colin to a 5-0 record against the largest event that we're going to talk about this weekend at 40 players. And with that, we'll move on to some spice. Some ancient evil from the days of yore. Nightmares of them have been suffered by many a 40k player over the course of the edition, but Drukhari are slowly seeping back to the undefeated tables, because the next event we're going to talk about is the Cross Swords War at the Westward. This is a 31-player GT held in the United Kingdom and was won by George McCullough and his Drukhari. This Drukhari list is pretty sweet and includes a lot of quality of life benefits from the removal of some of the nerfs that Drukhari had experienced in previous data slates. It is a Realspace Raid detachment, taking a trio of subfaction abilities on all of its different styles of Drukhari subfactions. For those who don't know, a Realspace Raid is basically a special type of Drukhari detachment that allows all of its different subfactions to benefit from their subfaction abilities. Drukhari has 3 different styles of subfactions: the Cults, Cabals, and Covens, and while normally you can only choose one of them to actually benefit from their subfaction abilities for each Drukhari detachment that you build, a Realspace Raid imposes some restrictions on you, most namely the requirement to take HQs from each of those, but in return gives you the ability to benefit from all of those abilities. Now, in addition, it also gives the Archon, who must be your warlord, a core locked aura of rerolls for anything in the detachment. We're taking Cabal of the Black Heart for that floating hit reroll on the Cabal units, Master Torturers and Splinter Blades on the Homunculus Covens, giving them exploding 6s to hit, and allowing them to use their stratagem to reroll wounds for 1 CP cheaper. This is especially useful on the big bricks of Grotesques or Talos that we're going to see in the list. And Precise Killers and Test of Skill for the Witch Cults, giving them their rending ability on a 5+ rather than just 6s, and +1 to wound against monsters and vehicles. The list is led by that aforementioned Master Archon, who is rocking Eternal Hatred for full hit and wound rerolls in the fight phase alongside the Jin Blade. Being a Master Archon, he does have the ability to fight twice as well, meaning that all of those rerolls are going to be doubled at least once per game. A Homunculus with Master Regenerist to give him a flat 3 heal on his monsters rather than just the D3 he has normally, as well as the Poisoner's Ampule to deal mortal wounds and remove aura abilities to and from an enemy unit, alongside a Triptych Whip and Show Stealer Succubus with Precision Blows, a pretty classic combination with a 2+ poison 2 damage weapon with the ability to convert that damage into mortal wounds. We all have 10 Hecatrix Blood Brides in the troop slot, alongside 5 Cabalite Warriors and 2 units of 5 Racks. We also have 2 units of 4 Grotesques. These guys start to form the base of a little bit of a resilient core to the Drukhari army. They're able to embark into the Cabal transports and then can hop out onto objectives, and with that discounted full wound rerolls, do some serious damage in melee. 2 units of 5 Incubi as well, add some additional hitting power. A unit of 6 Mandrakes, interestingly, which is a strange spot for Mandrakes to be. It does allow them to score, retrieve battlefield data without having to roll for it, but it does mean that positioning them is a lot harder because they now are subject to the 6 model coherency rules rather than 5 models, which means that they're not able to screen as well as a 5 model unit of Mandrakes would do. 2 units of 3 Reavers as well to pack on some additional damage and to be utility units. These guys' speed make them excellent for secondaries like behind enemy lines, as well as 3 Raiders with Dark Lances to carry around those Grotesques and Hecatrix Blood Brides, as well as 3 Talos in a unit. Now, these guys regained their core keyword, which they had lost in previous data slates, which allows them to benefit from a lot of the character orders, most notably +1 toughness from the Homunculus to make them much more difficult to kill, as well as rerolls to hit from the Master Archon, especially alongside the full wound rerolls in melee for 1 CP rather than 2. This makes this unit an absolute brick of damage, getting close to full rerolls, especially hitting on 2s rerolling 1s from that Archon once Power from Pain ticks up far enough and gives them +1 to hit, alongside full wound rerolls, makes them absolutely lethal in melee. They also have 2 Heat Lances, which are D6 +2 damage Melta weapons, so those hit rerolls are going to be benefiting them both in the shooting and fight phases. I didn't mention it before, but there's also a Court of the Archon, just an extremely resilient unit built out of a lot of different smaller unit types. 4 Slith and 2 Urgles in that unit to soak wounds, and these guys can bodyguard for the Master Archon, allowing him to get up the table and use that Eternal Hatred and grant those rerolls to the more offensively oriented Homunculus Coven units. What's nice to see Realspace Raid get brought back into the fore in Arcs of Omen. This is a bit of a classic style of Drukhari, and I haven't seen its like on the table in a really long time, so it's nice to see it come back. At the event, George had a bit of an interesting set of matches to get to his undefeated record, taking down Grey Knights in Route 1 before hitting a Drukhari Mirror in Round 2. What are the odds of that at this day and age? Absolutely wild. Grey Knights again in Round 3. It's starting to feel like early or late 2021, I think, was Grey Knights versus Drukhari every single game. Wow, this is a real blast from the past. But we do hit Leagues of Votann in the semifinals, as well as Manny Chima's Space Wolves in the finals, which George was able to take down and win 5-0. So huge congratulations to him for that. I love these Drukhari lists. They're extremely technical, super duper lethal, and it's nice to see them back at the cutting, bleeding, torturous end of the metagame. And with that, we'll get to the spiciest and most interesting undefeated list from this past weekend. This is from ValleyCon 2023 from Upper Hutt, New Zealand, like Jabba the Hutt. This is a 30-player GT that unfortunately did not use the new data slate. The rules cut off basically 1 day before the release of the data slate. Very unfortunate. But for the list that we're about to talk about, that actually doesn't change that much. This was Michael Stewart's Ultramarines, but not really Ultramarines. It was actually, in fact, Emperor's Spears. Now, for those who don't know, Emperor's Spears is a bit of an oddity within the Space Marine Super faction. They are a White Dwarf supplement chapter and an Ultramarines successor. Being almost entirely melee oriented, it positions them in an extremely weird place. That said, they are an example of one of the few successor chapters that Games Workshop has designed internally that actually works and doesn't have just a random smattering of chapter tactics and abilities that don't make sense or form a cohesive game plan. Emperor's Spears are laser focused on killing people in melee with infantry. They play almost exactly like a Space Wolves army, but instead have the Ultramarines mechanics, which is absolutely wild. They're given the mechanical equivalents of the Hungry for Battle and Whirlwind of Rage chapter tactics, giving them exploding 6s to hit in the first round of combat in melee and +1 to advance and charge rolls. Now, the reason that this is relevant is because the list that we're talking about today does actually bring an Ultramarines unit in it, even though he is not an actual Ultramarine successor, because he is Roboute Guilliman himself, the Primarch of the Ultramarines chapter proper. None of his chapter-specific abilities carry over to Ultramarine successors. He does not grant his full rerolls, and he doesn't grant his rerolls to wound. But what he does do is retain his Imperium-wide +1 to advance and charge aura, meaning that once this is baked in with the +1 to advance and charge that Emperor Spears already get, the entire army is +2 to advance and charge rolls, making it basically have a Canticle of Hate built in all the time permanently, which is real good. That means that, most specifically, you can free your Chaplain up to cast some of the other super powerful Chaplain buffs like Exhortation of Rage, which is just a targeted +1 to wound in melee. You can just give your units +1 to wound in Space Marines, but nobody does it because Space Marines already have a tough enough time getting into melee that they usually don't need to benefit from it. But in this list, you can. I talked a while ago about a White Scars list that used basically the same interaction to force massive threat ranges out of Space Marine units and then use their resources elsewhere to do more targeted damage buffs. And Emperor Spears have more in the way of especially wound buffs than White Scars do, although they don't benefit from the White Scars super doctrine or other chapter-specific effects. The list in particular had that Primaris Master of Sanctity with that Exhortation of Rage. He's bringing the Seal of Oath, allowing him to target an enemy unit and give a full hit and wound reroll aura from himself against that enemy unit. Really useful for taking down knights or large characters, stuff like that. Big bricks of enemies get absolutely removed by this guy. And we're going to see this effect a lot once 10th edition takes over. Oh boy. We also have 2 units of Assault Intercessors with Thunderhammers in them, 2 units of 5 Infiltrators with Helix Gauntlets. The important thing about these units is that we're keeping them all to 5 models to benefit from the Emperor Spear specific stratagem, which I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of right now. Skotvakara Ulzorn. We nailed it. That gives +1 to wound as long as it's the first round of combat to a core or character Emperor Spears unit. The army's rocking a brace of melee infantry, including 5 aggressors, 2 units of 5 Vanguard veterans with the classic Lightning Claw and Storm Shield builds, alongside Relic Blades on the sergeants, 2 Landspeeder Tornadoes for some extra added punch, alongside 3 Eradicators and a Gladiator Reaper, a Landspeeder Storm to carry 5 Scouts in it, as well as a Relic Contemptor Dreadnought, bit of a throwback to that guy. The Relic Contemptor Dreadnought benefits from that Seal of Oath enormously because those wound rerolls allow it to trigger its mortal wound effect from the Volkites a little bit more often. It definitely plows a lot of damage into whatever's being targeted by the Seal of Oath. Last but not least, we have obviously that Roboute Guilliman and a Judiciar. This guy bringing a bunch of unique Emperor Spears tech, including the Reliquary of Vengeance and Sentinel of the Veil Warlord trait. The Reliquary of Vengeance allows for a spike of additional damage, which is a once per game aura of +1 attack. This is an enormous pulse of damage, especially from units like those Aggressors or Assault Intercessor squads that can be benefiting from +1 to wound, full hit rerolls, a bunch of other effects from the Emperor Spears arsenal. Sentinel of the Veil allows for a 6-inch heroic intervention and allows the Judiciar to always fight first, basically giving him the effect of charging on his opponent's turn. Now, extended intervention abilities are great for Judiciars because they essentially extend the range at which they can ignite their Tempora Mortis ability. Because the Tempora Mortis triggers at the start of the fight phase, it happens after heroic interventions have resolved, meaning that while normally your opponent would have to be worried about a 3-inch bubble from that guy forcing fight lasts on them, they now have to worry about the full 6 because he can move 6 inches closer towards you to get within 3 inches of a unit that you don't want to fight last and force the fight last on it. And again, because a lot of these Emperor Spears abilities trigger on the first round of combat regardless of whether or not they charged, an Emperor Spears unit hitting you in melee can then benefit from all of these effects, get rerolls, get +1 to wound, and then absolutely slaughter you before it comes to your turn to swing. He can also potentially move around his +1 attack aura, I guess, in some circumstances, which is kind of pretty sweet. Overall, This list is one after my own heart. It uses some real esoteric mechanic that don't really see played too often, and it's cool to see these supplements get picked up so far after they've been published and still used with the newfound technology of things like Reboot Gilliman to bring them back into the fold. In round 1, the list played against World Eaters on the Scouring, beating Iron Hands in round 2 on Secure Missing Artifacts. And remember, this is pre-nerf Iron Hands, so they are still getting the full benefit of that Codex Warfare, something that only benefits the Emperor's Spears list a little bit. They have a few heavy weapons to benefit from it. Beating Necrons on Conversion in round 3, Hail of Doom Eldari on Abandoned Sanctuaries in round 4, before having an extremely exciting draw in round 5 on Data Scry Salvage. That was versus Grey Knights and Beleth. Both Michael and the Grey Knights player as the 2 undefeated players at the event. However, Michael with higher tiebreakers was able to come ahead on the final placings, putting him at number 1 in the event at 4-0-1. And with that, that is all of the lists that I have to talk to you about today. Let me know down in the comment section which one was your favorite and if you would take any of these to a tournament. And also let me know what you think of this format where I talk about a bunch of different lists rather than focusing on one list or one faction. I had a lot of fun doing it, and this was a pretty weird weekend with a lot of really interesting event wins from interesting lists. I think people are really coming out of the woodwork with some interesting stuff. Now we're coming to the tail end of the edition. Anyway, big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.